Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Climate Migration, a webinar exploring the link between environmental conditions and migration. Tonight's event is being offered by two wonderful organizations working at the intersection of faith and environment, Water Spirit, and the New Jersey chapter of the Laudato Si movement. Water Spirit is a spiritual ecology nonprofit sponsored by the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace. Through programs and advocacy, Water Spirit helps people of all faiths love and protect sacred water. Water Spirit was founded in 1998. The Laudato Si movement is a global Catholic network working to inspire and mobilize the Catholic community to care for our common home and achieve climate and ecological justice in collaboration with all people of goodwill. The New Jersey chapter has been recently formed. I am Blair Nelson. I'm Executive Director of Water Spirit, and it's my pleasure to be moving things along this evening, being our Master of Ceremonies. Before we get into the event, I would like to share a land acknowledgement. Water Spirit is headquartered on the homeland of the Navasinkolene Lenape on the peninsula called Navarumsunk. And my personal residency in New Jersey is the result of generations of my family's migration from Europe to Turtle Island. And part of that migration contributed to the waves of forced migration of Lenape-Hoking's original rights holders. Water Spirit respectfully acknowledges the Lenape people's past, present, and future here in Lenape-Hoking and throughout the diaspora. We offer our commitment to establish just and right relations with these lands, waters, and people. During tonight's webinar, we will get to hear from three amazing women, experts in their field, who are working with migrants in day to day, who are influencing policy, who are taking care of people. And I'm so excited to introduce them to you one by one right before they take the floor. And after each of them shares some thoughts with us, hopefully we'll have enough time at the end for a question and answer session before we wrap things up. A few housekeeping notes. Please make sure to keep your microphones on mute throughout this call. Please note that this call is being recorded. It will be shared out to registrants as well as shared on YouTube and other communications channels from both organizations. And as you listen to our amazing speakers, please feel free to drop any questions you might have into the chat, or you can hold on to them until the question and answer portion. And with that, it is now my pleasure to welcome Terrence Thompson to take the mic to lead us through an opening prayer. Just to tell you a little bit about him, Terrence Thompson is the coordinator of the New Jersey chapter of the Laudato Si movement. Together with his wife, Cheryl, he also participates in the Social Justice Committee of St. Anthony of Padua Parish in Hightstown, New Jersey. Prior to his involvement with the Laudato Si movement, Terry had a long career as an environment and health advisor for the World Health Organization, a position from which he gained an appreciation for the importance climate change and other environmental factors as determinants of public health. Terry, thank you very much for leading us through tonight's prayer.
Thank you very much, Blair, and thank you for that nice introduction. So this prayer comes from Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, from his encyclical entitled Laudato Si. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Terry. It's now my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Amali Tower. Amali Tower is a refugee and migration expert. She is founder and executive director of the nonprofit organization Climate Refugees. Amali has extensive global experience in refugee protection, resettlement, forced migration, and displacement contexts, having worked for NGOs, the UN Refugee Agency, and the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. She is a member of the World Economic Forum Expert Network in Migration, Human Rights, and Humanitarian Response, and the UC Berkeley Climate Refugees Working Group. From responding to Afghan evacuations to overseeing Syrian refugee resettlement, Amali is consulted for her expertise in humanitarian contexts, human rights, and public policy. Amali serves displaced populations as an experienced defender and her clients as a partner and advisor. She developed her worldviews and deep commitment to forcibly displaced populations through a lived experience. She's born of that education, life in multiple countries, and those at Columbia University, where she earned a Master of International Affairs focused in human rights from the School of International and Public Affairs, and a Bachelor of Arts in International Development Studies from UCLA. She resides in New York City. Amali, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Blair. It's really kind. Thank you, Terrence. Thank you for leading us with a really great framing. Thank you to the organizers for bringing us all together and convening a very important conversation, not just as forced migration and displacement is a massive global problem, but also front and center right here in the United States, right? I mean, we can't really understand what's going on at our border, just outside of it, or within the many growing detention facilities in this country, and the very complex web of policy decisions that are so tied to migration now, both domestically and around the world. So I've been asked to kind of provide in 10 minutes a landscape overview of where climate migration sort of sits within the bigger migration, displacement, refugees scheme. I'm not going to stop on too many things, but I'm so happy to go deeper into topics or specific areas as you all have questions. So I'll try to be brief and quick. Blair, feel free to stop me if I'm going over. I'm going to try to keep track of time and also provide you a little overview of the legal frameworks, and then hopefully we can have a very good conversation. So let me begin by just sort of saying that, what are we talking about when we talk about displacement, refugees, migration? And notice how there are so many terms to basically talk about the fact that people are increasingly on the move, despite the fact that their most ardent desire is to stay at home. I mean, I think that's something we can all relate to. And that's a whole other webinar in itself. But we're talking about 118 million people that are globally displaced around the world due to conflict, violence, climate change. That is about 1.4% of the global population. So we're talking like what looks like an entire country full of people that are actually displaced for reasons that are well beyond theirs to control or mitigate. The world's displaced are comprised of refugees, internally displaced persons, asylum seekers, and then also people who may not even fit neatly into these kinds of categories, but are considered people of concern to UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency. The vast majority of people displaced, either within their countries or across their own borders, reside very often for the rest of their lives in low to middle income countries. So by that, I mean, consider the fact that about, somewhere between 75 to 80% of the world's displaced are living in low income countries, what you might largely consider the global south. That number might vary a little bit. Sometimes you might, in the last few years, primarily since Ukraine. You've seen that number, which was always in the 80th percentile, now going to the 70s, so it slightly varies a bit, but by and large, the message is that, it's the burden or the welcoming, as I would like to frame that, is being carried and provided by low middle income countries in the global south. So when people are moving across borders, they generally tend to move to neighboring countries. That's why you see that. On average, when it comes to climate, about 23 million people are displaced every year due to climate disasters, and we've only known about that since keeping data since about 2008. People are displaced when we say due to events that are precipitated by climate change. Well, we can understand these as slow onset events and sudden onset events. Slow onset events are things that look like environmental degradation. So if you are a population dependent on the land, you're farmers, you're indigenous farmers, think about Central Americans and Mexican farmers who are coming to our US southern border and are increasingly being shut out. Think about, it's a sort of dehumanizing language we've used in the past to describe these people. We codify everybody into what's called like a caravan, as if to not really see the person. These have been, by and large, indigenous farmers coming from places that are no longer habitable and suitable for livelihoods that they have sustained, for millennia. Through no fault of their own, those lands aren't really arable anymore. So that's one example. Drought, sea level rise, biodiversity loss. These would be slow onset climate driven events. Sudden onset events are the rising intensity and frequency of disasters like hurricanes, cyclones, floods, torrential rainfall. Extreme heat feels sudden sometimes because it just kind of comes on, but it sort of fits into both. Available data tells us that the majority of people are displaced internally within their own countries, but I caveated that with available data. That just happens to be what we know because it's what's neater and more easily accessible to understand. We're not really asking people who move across borders about climate because it tends to be, an interplay of factors. And I'll say that the interplay of factors exists for everybody, whether you're moving within a country or across borders. And a point I can return to later, otherwise I'm going to go well over my time here. So climate change, though, I can tell you, is increasingly the driving force behind all kinds of movements of people. Climate data modeling projects a variety of numbers for how many people will be forced to move internally due to climate change. You have data from the World Bank. You have data that says a billion people could be displaced by 2050. I think one of the key messages I'd like to maybe have us all leave with is that the numbers are just projections. Nobody really knows. And the numbers are not the story, although that tends to be what everybody runs with. And the higher the number, no matter how well-intentioned people are in these models and projections, have tended to entice more stronger xenophobic narratives, closed borders, more money being directed to climate security and border security instead of more adaptive, welcoming, and participatory responses. And keep that in mind when you think about the work you're doing that is so increasingly hostile to immigrants in not just in the United States but all around the world. And you'll also note that in that point, that these policies tend to be the most draconian in countries that are responsible for the climate crisis. So there is a double injustice in having created the problem and then also in how it is meeting the moment. So the current global landscape, besides displacement, I should mention, is that this is all happening amidst declining foreign assistance. More than 30% of humanitarian funding has disappeared over the past 2 years. This is severely impacting migration, asylum, refugee protection systems in refugee host countries as well, then, right? Or welcome, because remember what I said about global South countries. Overseas development assistance is reducing by about 62 billion this year. So now remember, how can you even withstand the impacts of a multitude of factors in your country, climate being right up at the top, if you're not even now getting assistance that was already quite meager to begin with. Migrants are being vilified. I mentioned this already. Borders are closing. And key to that is that there's been some very good data that shows that the historic polluters are spending upwards of 2 times more on securing their borders than they are on providing climate finance. Climate adaptation finance is what builds resilience for people to be able to stay, to move if they must, to really do anything that is adaptive to these changing circumstances. The term is to encompass a whole suite of things that fall under migration. Really, the term that's now being used is climate mobility, and by that encompasses migration, both internal and across borders, displacement of people, both again internally and across borders, planned relocation. Sometimes you'll hear this used as managed retreat. They're basically the same thing, some slight differences. But planned relocation, again, is an adaptive capacity. Maybe you have to move people out of harm's way. Rising sea levels is a very good example of that. Immobility also needs to be understood within mobility, right? Because mobility for me is like a bit of a difficult term because it almost implies that people have a lot of agency in how they're able to get out of harm's way. And of course, everybody on this webinar knows nothing could be further from the truth. Immobility also then looks like being trapped in place. And another thing that I've been kind of going on and on about for many years and is maybe slowly starting to gain some traction is we should also be talking about the right to stay. You know, as much if you're responding to the needs of people on the move once they've been forced to move, you're already a little bit too late, aren't we? Because we really need to be looking at asking people what they're going through and what do they want. And in my nearly 25 years of work now doing this, I've never heard one driver as the only reason why someone is on the move. That's one. And two, I've never heard anybody actually say, yeah, moving is my first choice. It's always, can I stay and can I return home? My own work has been in climate has been informed by refugees who told me there was nothing to return home to. And that was my gateway to understanding environmental degradation in East Africa and droughts and what that looks like for a mother who can't feed her family. Turning very quickly to the law, there is no distinct legally binding framework that protects people displaced for reasons of climate change. That's not to say that we don't have a suite of tools and instruments. It is believed, as I said, that most people are displaced internally within their borders. But I want to say that, remember, because this is happening disproportionately to countries who've contributed nothing to global warming and the effects of climate change, it's then a very unjust thing, too, to just say, oh, well, it's mostly internal, so we shouldn't really all, lose our minds over the fact that people are going to be moving across borders. Because remember how destabilizing this is then for countries who already are dealing with rising poverty, increasing inequality, are highly underdeveloped, are dealing with the effects of colonial legacies, on and on and on it goes. So now, if you have people displaced within their own countries, do you really have national governments, infrastructure, and institutions that are able to then respond to that? No, you do not. So that's really, I think, the key thing I would love for people to think about when you continue to hear, listen, climate migration is largely internal. It's a way of trying to pacify the global north's very alarmist and draconian responses to this, but it also then misses. So then shouldn't we be even more concerned with ensuring, shoring up the resilience of host governments that have to then deal with this? Let me quickly kind of move along to say, though, that, within the Refugee Convention, which is the 1951 Refugee Convention, refugees are those who, due to a well-founded fear of persecution, leave their own countries and are seek protection in a country other than their own for reasons of race, of persecution along the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So you'll note that climate change isn't really in there, but in 1951, we were really dealing, I consider this very much a colonial construct, right? We were dealing with the consequences of World War II. And at that time, it had a limitation for only covering people who were Europeans who were displaced on account of World War II. And it had a temporal limitation of it wasn't supposed to last this long. So it had a geographic and a temporal limitation. In 1967, with the fall of, the birth of so many new states under post-colonial, paradigms, we have this shift. And so I really like to also mention that to say, are we also not now in another type of world order where we need to maybe understand that, maybe we need a wider understanding of how this very instrument can be applicable to people who are also moving for a lot more complex factors. So I do want to say, though, that there are regional refugee conventions as well in Africa and Latin America, for example, who have a wider definition, which includes things that quote unquote say events that disturb the public order. So I think all I want to say about this is countries with a lived experience of the legacies of colonialism, the legacies of interstate war and intrastate war, and now also international systems that haven't necessarily been fair or haven't had governance structures that had their own inputs. It's not surprising to me that these countries have a wider definition that's a little bit more empathic and also are leading the way, Africa especially, with regional instruments and a whole lot of other bilateral agreements that extend a lot more protections to people within their own countries, to people in neighboring countries, and then also as an entire continent are offering a whole lot more protections. Very lastly, I'll just say that the US once showed great leadership in this area, but didn't do much with it, although it had a lot of fanfare about we're going to do all these things. It didn't in the end, and now we're in a slightly more abysmal situation where not just refugee protections but immigration protections are in a really dark place. So I don't mean to leave it on that sort of sad note, but I think it might set us up for further conversation, and I'm happy to elaborate, and thank you for this again. Over to you, Blair.
Thank you for providing that overview of a very broad scope of material of understanding climate migration within this larger field of climate mobility. Note taken, as well as how that global situation has been changing in recent years and been impacted by changes in global politics. So thank you very much, Amali. I'm sure we're eager to dive into so much of what you just shared with us later on in this conversation. But at this time, it is my pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Cecily Kern. Cecily Kern is the Global Policy and Research Advocate with Mercy International Association, where she focuses on connecting Mercy experiences at the grassroots to international advocacy at the United Nations. Cecily currently serves as chair of the NGO Committee on Migration, a civil society coalition engaging on the wide range of migrant and refugee issues with UN member states and UN entities for advocacy and action. Since 2014, she has represented communities of women religious at the United Nations and engaged in advocacy related to gender equality, human rights, human mobility, and climate justice. Prior to working at the UN, Cecily worked as an immigration paralegal at a Washington, D.C. nonprofit, accompanying migrants, refugees, and their families through the U.S. immigration system. Cecily has a Master of International Affairs from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and a Bachelor of Arts in Diplomacy and World Affairs and Spanish Literary Studies from Occidental College. Cecily, you are warmly welcome to take the floor.
Thanks so much, Blair. It's funny that both Amali and I are SEPA alum, and we both went to undergrad in Los Angeles, and we both live in New York. It is such a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you so much to Water Spirit and the Laudato Si Movement New Jersey chapter for convening this important webinar. It really is wonderful to be here with all of you and a privilege to join this conversation. Like Blair mentioned, I represent Mercy International Association at the United Nations, and it's my role to facilitate communications between Mercy sisters, associates, and partners in mission at the local level with policymakers at the United Nations. And based on the reflections and the work of Mercy sisters and partners, Mercy International Association focuses on two priority justice issues: the degradation of Earth and the displacement of persons, both of which speak directly to climate-related migration and the injustices that compel people to move. And like our other faith-based colleagues, Mercy International Association brings a moral voice from the local level to the UN, grounded in shared commitments to peace, justice, human rights, and care for creation. And in migration, we're called to welcome the stranger and stand in solidarity with migrants, especially where dignity and access to basic rights are most at risk. And we bring practical expertise from grassroots ministries that accompany people who are excluded or underserved, often filling gaps where governments cannot or do not provide support. And because we work closely with communities, we also help connect what happens at the UN back to the local level. So our advocacy and programs remain aligned with international standards and can support accountability at home. And as people of Mercy, along with our other faith-based and civil society partners, we play an important role in influencing policymakers at all levels to protect the rights of people on the move and address the systemic issues that affect migration and displacement worldwide. And one of the ways that we do this is by working in coalition with other like-minded organizations to influence policy at the UN. So Mercy International Association has been a longstanding member of the NGO Committee on Migration, and after 4 years, I'm at the very end of my tenure as chair of the committee. The Committee on Migration was created 20 years ago, and we currently have 4 active thematic subcommittees that drive our collective work. One of these is our Climate and Environment Subcommittee, which is dedicated to advocating for the rights and dignity of all persons affected by climate and environment-related migration and displacement within countries and across borders. Recognizing the complex and interlinked nature of climate-induced mobility, our advocacy is really guided by an urgent call for action and a commitment to a human rights-based approach that upholds the principles of justice, equality, and inclusion. Much of this work has been in the context of the Global Forum for Migration and Development, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the Global Compact for Migration and its review at the International Migration Review Forum, which just took place a month ago. So the rest of my remarks will focus primarily on that process. Just for a little bit of context, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration was adopted in 2018. It was the first comprehensive international framework on migration, and it was especially important for climate mobility because Objective 2 calls on states to address the adverse drivers of migration, including disasters, climate change, and environmental degradation. And Objective 5 encourages the expansion and flexibility of regular pathways, offering concrete policy space for safer and more dignified movement when sudden onset disasters and slow onset effects of climate change and environmental degradation make migration necessary. And similar to what Amali said, through the Global Compact for Migration, which is a non-legally binding document, the dominant framing is now talking about human mobility in the context of disasters and climate change, which is broader and perhaps more politically palatable than other terms that have implications for international protection obligations. And that shift matters because it lets policymakers discuss internal displacement, planned relocation, regular migration pathways, and protection in a single conversation, but it also makes the agenda harder to translate into binding legal commitments. So ahead of and during the review of the Global Compact for Migration this year at the International Migration Review Forum, the NGO Committee on Migration called for a rights-based, people-centered response to climate mobility that recognizes the full range of experiences, those on the move, those who are internally displaced, those who remain or are stuck and cannot migrate. Our advocacy stressed that climate change and environmental degradation are no longer distant risks. They are already driving displacement, undermining livelihoods, and threatening dignity, identity, and survival. Climate change and environmental harm are not just drivers of displacement, they also shape where people can move, how safely they can travel, where they can settle, and what kind of work they can do once they arrive. And that means that migration policy can't be separated from climate policy, labor policy, housing policy, health policy, or environmental justice. And so we urge governments to respond with urgency and coherence by strengthening mitigation, adaptation, and measures addressing loss and damage, by upholding both the right to move and the right to stay and adapt in place, by providing targeted protection for people unable to migrate, and by integrating climate mobility across development, social protection, and humanitarian policy. The current discourse on climate migration is moving from whether the issue matters. Now it's understood it absolutely does, but now we're moving into how to govern it. The governance architecture really remains quite fragmented, uneven, and it heavily tilts towards reducing displacement risk rather than creating mobility pathways. States and institutions are still treating climate mobility through multiple silos, including the Global Compact for Migration, but also the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Paris Agreement, and regional initiatives that all touch upon climate mobility, but no single framework fully owns it. And this has advantages and disadvantages. It has created real innovation, especially at the regional level, but it also leaves major gaps in accountability, financing, and institutional responsibility. And so our message has been that climate-related mobility has to be governed not by fear or fragmentation, but by cooperation, protection, and respect for human agency, ensuring that people can make informed and dignified decisions about migration. Unfortunately, at the recent IMRF, climate mobility didn't receive the level of explicit attention that it deserves, especially compared with the stronger recognition in 2022 at the previous International Migration Review Forum. And in 2022, they were able to say that climate change, disasters, and environmental degradation are adverse drivers of migration. They specifically listed various policy advancements and recommendations related to climate mobility, but this year they didn't. While the core language of the Global Compact from 2018 remains in place, the 2026 outcome didn't clearly deepen commitments on either reducing the drivers of displacement under Objective 2 or expanding regular pathways under Objective 5 related to climate specifically. The 2026 Progress Declaration negotiations were particularly contentious, which isn't surprising given the volatile political environment. But this meant that member states who might otherwise have been supportive of stronger commitments on climate mobility spent a lot of their time, energy, and political capital on other urgent and fundamental concerns to avoid backsliding. And that means that the challenge now is not just to restate the problem, but to encourage states to move towards concrete action on stronger adaptation and displacement prevention measures and more accessible regular pathways, including humanitarian visas, temporary protection, and planned relocation when movement becomes necessary. Even though climate mobility was sidelined from the official Progress Declaration negotiations, various side events highlighted human mobility in the context of disasters, climate change, environmental degradation, and they also emphasized the need for regular migration pathways, planned relocation, and better protection for people on the move. But the review also exposed a major governance gap, that the policy architecture is still far more developed for addressing drivers than creating safe, regular, and rights-based mobility options. And that gap really matters because climate crises are already forcing people to move internally and across borders. And I won't repeat everything that Amali so comprehensive shared before me, But it's really clear that people don't simply choose to migrate under all of these conditions. They move because the conditions for staying with dignity have been undermined. And we need to consider what happens after a movement begins. So people on the move face environmental risks during transit, extreme heat, unsafe terrain, contaminated water, overcrowding, and lack of shelter. At destination, many migrants end up in environmentally compromised neighborhoods, informal settlements, or areas with poor infrastructure and limited access to clean water, sanitation, and healthcare. And often they are also concentrated in jobs that are exposed to extreme temperatures, pesticides, and other hazards with weak labor protections and little access to remedy. So the IMRF made clear that the policy challenge is not just about acknowledging these realities, but about governing them better and more coherently. And for climate migration, that should translate into a more integrated approach across adaptation, disaster risk reduction, migration governance, and labor rights. There is some reason for cautious optimism. The IMRF also showed that local and regional governance are where a lot of the most practical progress is happening. The Platform on Disaster Displacement has documented that regions are increasingly shaping national policy development, and that the most recent instruments that are emerging are at the local level. Examples and experiences from the regions include freedom of movement arrangements, humanitarian visas, and emerging guidance on planned relocation. And these aren't a full solution yet, but they show that policy innovation is possible when states work together across borders and sectors. I haven't even touched on SB 64 or the UNFCCC process, but as important as it is to strengthen climate discourse and migration policy, we also have to incorporate human mobility into conversations about climate adaptation and loss and damage, especially how adaptation finance and local planning and regional cooperation can support mobility with dignity, but that'll have to be for the next webinar. For us, the policy implication is really clear. We need to move from recognition to implementation, and that leaves us with 5 priorities. First, we need to expand regular migration pathways for people affected by climate and environmental harm. And if mobility is part of adaptation, then states need legal, accessible, and predictable options for entry, stay, and mobility, especially when return is unsafe or unsustainable. Second, we need planned relocation frameworks that are rights-based, community-driven, and supported by adequate finance. Relocation should never be treated as a technocratic exercise. It has to protect community ties, livelihoods, cultural identity, and human dignity. Third, we need stronger protection for migrants on the move and at destination. And that includes safe shelter, healthcare, disaster preparedness, access to information, legal assistance, and protection from exploitation, trafficking, and labor abuse. Because climate vulnerability doesn't end at borders, and in many cases, it intensifies. Fourth, we need labor policy and occupational safety standards that reflect environmental realities. Migrants shouldn't be concentrated in the most dangerous jobs with the weakest protections. Heat stress, pesticide exposure, unsafe housing, and informal work are all part of the climate migration nexus, and they require coordinated responses from labor ministries, employers, unions, and local governments. And fifth, we need financing that follows the problems. So the IMRF discussion made clear that many states can agree on principles, but without sustained funding, implementation remains shallow. And so climate finance, adaptation finance, and migration governance resources have to be linked more deliberately so that frontline communities, the cities, municipalities, and civil society can actually deliver protection and resilience. So this is where faith-based actors and civil society have a critical role. We can help to keep the focus on human dignity, solidarity, and accountability. We can remind policymakers that migrants are not just abstractions and that the burden of climate change is falling most heavily on those who have contributed least to it. And we can also insist that environmental justice includes the right to move safely, the right to remain if possible, and the right to live and work in conditions that don't endanger life and health. In Laudato Si', Pope Francis reminded us that everything is connected. The IMRF confirmed that global policy is starting to catch up with that truth, but only partially. And so the task now is to make governance as integrated as the challenges we face. So we remain committed to policies that are preventive, protective, and practical. We can build pathways when movement is necessary. We can protect people where they are and where they go, and we can ensure that responsible climate migration is not that the response to climate migration is not fear or exclusion, but justice, dignity, and shared responsibility. Sorry for going over my time, but thanks, Blair.
Thank you, Cecily. That was wonderful. Thank you for identifying some of those gaps, but also progress in these conversations happening at the UN level. And you already addressed one of the questions that came up for me, which is, do you see progress happening at other levels that might be moving a little bit faster than these commitments at the UN? So local and regional level showing some promise. Sounds pretty promising. I appreciated the 5 points that you outlined at the end as well, and I suspect that our listeners might also enjoy taking a look at those again if you have the ability to pop them in the chat while we're talking. So thank you very much. And now I am pleased to welcome our last speaker of the night, Sister Susan Francois, who is a person who I would love to platform at everything that we do, because it's wonderful to hear her speak, and she's brilliant, and she's bringing some particularly timely reflections into this conversation about what she's seeing at Delaney Hall in New Jersey. But to read the bio that's actually on the screen in front of me, Sister Susan is the Assistant Congregation Leader and Congregation Treasurer for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace, Water Spirit sponsors. She has served in congregation leadership since 2015. Sister Susan is an author, writing for Global Sisters Report and other publications on religious life and social justice. She previously ministered as a social justice educator and advocate at the Intercommunity Peace and Justice Center in Seattle, Washington. Sister Susan presently serves on the boards of All Africa Sister to Sister Conference, Investor Advocates for Social Justice, Holy Name Medical Center, and the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace charitable incorporated organization in the United Kingdom. For months, she has been providing support to families at Delaney Hall in Newark, New Jersey, through her affiliation with the Eyes on Ice New Jersey Coalition. Given the events of the past few weeks, we're so glad that you're able to add your on-the-ground perspective to this webinar. And here I will turn things over to Sister Susan.
Thank you. So I do have a PowerPoint because that's how I roll, and I will try to keep to my time here. So just to talk about what migration looks like here in New Jersey, presuming my PowerPoint will actually work. And of course it's not. Okay, so I might just have to do it myself without that. Let me try one more time. But while that's going, I will not repeat all of the amazing things that the previous speaker said, because we're basically just looking at how that plays out here on the ground in the state of New Jersey. So let us try this one more time. There we go. Okay, so just to say that we have a lot of immigrants in New Jersey, over 2 million. About 500,000 are seen to be as undocumented. As we look at our broken immigration system, which was already broken and now has essentially been weaponized, it's important to know that there are people being impacted in families. So we're looking at the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor in real human lives, with mixed status families that are being torn apart, many children who I've gotten to know at Delaney Hall, whose parents are being denied due process and facing human rights violations. Just what our previous speakers spoke about, these are the top countries of origin as of 2023 of immigrants in our state. They're from all of these places in the global south. And our refugee asylum program, which has been dismantled, these are in large part the countries that people in Delaney Hall are from. So it's important to see that direct connection, as our speakers talked about, of our nation's policies on our immigrant neighbors and who is being impacted. And then I will not go into the intersecting drivers that you all talked about, but they are very real as to why people are here in New Jersey rather than home where they'd rather be. And then, as our last speaker started to talk about, once they come, and they're working because that's why they're here. They face many environmental hazards, which have direct links to our climate situation. And one concrete human example, because there are human beings behind all of these stories. You may have seen that just last week, Emmanuel was released from Delaney Hall. He has a very rare condition that I will try to pronounce, rhabdomyolysis, which is not so rare because there actually is a great intersection between migrants in those difficult work situations, in those transit situations that you talked about with the extreme heat, occupational hazards, dehydration, can lead to this disease. And so he ended up having to be held, well, they chose to hold him in isolation for 5 months because they would not let him use his crutches that you see in this picture because it's a weapon. And thankfully, due to the advocacy that's been happening, he has been released. Now he still has his whole immigration case, but he at least can now be with his wife and receive his medical care. So this is a human person in our community, one of our neighbors, who has been directly impacted by those environmental impacts. Another way that our previous speaker just spoke about was the communities that migrants are often drawn to, or for various reasons. And one I want to speak about the rest of my time here is where Delaney Hall is, which is the Ironbound district of Newark, New Jersey. It is a historic immigrant community. Today, 2 out of every 3 Ironbound residents are migrants, and there are undocumented there as well as documented people. It is a vibrant immigrant community. And it also has over 100 known contaminated sites. It is one of the most polluted zip codes in the Northeast. It has the benefit of all of those trucks that are going in and out of the Port of Elizabeth. And consequently, the children in the Ironbound have very high rates of asthma and other respiratory ailments. It also is where we are choosing to house not just warehouses of things, but warehouses of people. On Doremus Avenue, you have the Essex County Correctional Facility right next door to Delaney Hall. Now, the difference is the Essex County Correctional Facility is a government facility that has oversight for people who have been convicted of crimes. Delaney Hall next door is run under a private for-profit prison company, Geo Corporation, at a $60 million a year profit and a 15-year, $1 billion government contract. Within 1 mile of these 2 places where we warehouse people, there are at least 6 major polluting facilities, wastewater treatment, animal carcass processing, gas-powered energy, incinerator, and massive freight warehouses. Consequently, if you spend any time outside of Delaney Hall, which the families had to do, right now there's no visitation allowed, which is one of the major human rights violations right now. But over the past year, they were having to wait outside if it was 100 degrees, if it was 10 degrees. And the pollution, the air that those little geese, I took that picture 2 weeks before Memorial Day, that they suffer is very overwhelming. So it's very clear that this is not a space where we should be housing human beings, let alone all of the additional human rights violations that are happening there at Delaney Hall. There is, at the same time, a community of people who are hearing the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor and coming together as the Eyes on ICE New Jersey Coalition. It is a beautiful network of peaceful people who are there to center the needs of the families that are separated, to center the treatment of those that are in Delaney Hall. I could talk for hours about this, but essentially we have documented cases of people not receiving medical care, like Emmanuel, who was in that isolation for 5 months, of women who've had miscarriages and not received prenatal care, of people with stage 4 lung cancer that are being given Tylenol. I mean, I could just go on to the heartbreaking stories there. And at the same time, contrary to what the narrative is, almost all of those that are detained in Delaney Hall were following what had been told was a legal pathway. They are picked up at ICE check-ins. They are picked up at their court hearings. They are taken off of airplanes because TSA is sharing data with ICE, and it is very difficult for them to then get due process. Their due process in immigration court, one of the things I have done until the judges stopped letting us in is to be a friend of the court on their online hearings. The person in Delaney Hall is in a closet with dry rot behind them that I can see on the video. If they have an attorney, their attorney is another place online. The judge and the government attorney are in the courtroom. And when Senator Kim was there, he was not wrong that there are upwards of 75 to 100 cases on one immigrant judge's case in a day. So due process is not happening there. There are many, many, many things, and this intersection really of the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, we can't separate those out. I am happy to say that this is Bishop Manny Cruz. Cardinal Tobin has spoken out about what's happening at Delaney Hall. There are efforts, and I've loved the quotes from Pope Francis today, but I want to give us one from literally today from Pope Leo. He is in Spain at a major migration center there today, and this is what he said today. Human dignity has no passport and does not lose its value when crossing a border. And that really is what the effort at Delaney Hall is all about. What's been happening for the past few weeks with the violence, with the blocking of the deportation vans and the clashes with the state police and ICE, that is real. But the story that I hope you come away with is that the men and women that are in Delaney Hall have claimed their human dignity. They are standing for our human dignity by standing for theirs. And there have been people for this whole past year who have been there every single day as Eyes on ICE, raising these concerns, raising their voices, and more importantly, being present to the families. And that's just what I want to end with here. This is the link tree that Eyes on ICE keeps up to date, where if you wish to support these actual families in our state, you can go onto their GoFundMes, even just read their stories and pray for them would be really, really important. And then Rachel's going to, I think, put something in the chat, but we have had 5 letters come out from the men and women of Delaney Hall, and this one just came out this week, where the women are really calling for support, that they are normal women, they are not criminals, and you could read the whole letter there. I'm not going to go into it, but they have their demands summarized as freedom, dignity, and respect, and there is a call to action. And then lastly, if you are Catholic, if you are in the mood to pray, either come to Delaney Hall on Saturday. Myself and a sister of St. Joseph will be leading the rosary, and wherever you are, you could also just join us in that prayer. So I am half a minute over my time.
Thank you for bringing in that important context from the area of Newark, where migrants are being held in our state, and of course, those important stories of the actual humans, the actual families who are being impacted. Thank you very much, Sister Susan. Keeping an eye on the time, we have about 15 minutes now for some questions from the floor before we move into our closing remarks. So at this time, I'm going to ask you, as you are comfortable, either add your questions to the chat and we can read them out loud, or at this time, you can also feel free to unmute your microphones and jump in with your questions. Great. And as you're organizing your thoughts, I will also point out that Cecily did add her 5 advocacy points into the 5 international advocacy priorities beyond the IMRF into the chat. And Rachel and Susan are both adding in additional links for you to follow specific to New Jersey. All right, everyone. I see a hand from Renata. Feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, hello, my name is Renata. I'm from Mexico. And my question will be like, either you think that maybe in less than 5 years, well, probably the governments will start to use or have the laws necessary for these migrations, like climate migrations in general?
Any of our speakers are welcome to unmute and address the questions as they arise.
I'm not sure I followed the question fully. Do you want to paraphrase or repeat, Blair, or maybe, or if someone else understood it, please jump in, but I'm not sure I followed.
I would also appreciate a clarification on the question. Thank you.
Yeah, do you think that governments will actually start to use the laws that are necessary for EU topic?
Okay. Do we think that the governments will actually be using the whole suites of laws that we have to sort of support and help people who might be moving on account of climate? I think that's the question.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just offer a few thoughts. I'm sure Cecile and Sister Susan have some as well. I think it's largely a political question, and that's why we're in this situation, not just here in this country, but all around the world. Listen, we have a whole bunch of existing laws, and as Cecile so well showed us, or is it Cecily? Sorry about that. I need new prescription glasses, and I just noticed your name. But what's happening is we have a whole suite of options for protections for visas, for immigrations, for help people, to offer further climate resilience, to stop wars. We have tools, we have infrastructure, we have the mechanisms and methodology. What we've always lacked, to various degrees through the course of history and time, has been political will. And we've come a long way in terms of understanding political will today as like a community, but for the last 3-4 years, right, we've really seen this denigration of multilateralism. So what people did collectively at the UN, for example, or what we have done at least since the end of World War II to instill a mutual cooperation amongst not just peoples, but states at a state level, that's really being eroded. And I think you're seeing its worst manifestations in migration policy and also climate policy, to be fair. I think both those things are having a very negative watershed moment. So I certainly hope so, Renata. I will say that even with that bleak picture I just painted, there are countries leading the way. There are numerous states in Eastern Africa and Western Africa that are cooperating across borders to provide protections to people on the move on account of drought. Argentina has expressed interest in offering humanitarian visas to countries in Central America and Western Caribbean who are dealing with the ravages of climate change. We've seen Australia sign a treaty with Tuvalu, which I have some concerns with, but it's a step in the right direction. So there are instruments like this, and Africa as a whole, continent-wide through the African Union, are taking some really great strides. So there are pockets of political will. Look to those, and for not just hope, but also examples.
Yeah, I mean, I really re-echo what Amali just said about multilateralism. I think coming from the recent International Migration Review Forum that included all of the member states of the General Assembly, it the political will is there from a group of states to have something that looks like progress and forward movement on already established international commitments, but then there is also a severe rollback in other parts of the world, and a huge concern about practices like externalization that really push the responsibility of migration governance from countries of destination to countries of transit or third countries that people have never touched in their lives. And so we have some of both. And I think this crisis of multilateralism really does impact climate change discussions and negotiations and migration, both of which are inherently international. These are both issues that, by their very nature, cross borders and cross boundaries and affect everyone, and so need to be addressed in a community, an international community. No one state can address climate change on its own. No one state can address migration policy on its own. And so we're in a moment of fragility in the multilateral system. But again, we look to the regions, we look to smaller spaces, even when from the example of the United States, when national government is failing to create policies that are inclusive and rights-based, state and local, like city governments, are stepping up, and it's really cities primarily that welcome migrant communities. That this is the cities are where migrants work, go to school, receive where they are housed, where they access healthcare, all of those things. And so it's really important not just to be looking at the big picture of what's happening internationally, globally, but also to look at the ways that we can improve the lives of migrants and migrant communities at home, in the places, the very, very local places where we live.
Yeah, and I would just say that it's, I focused on New Jersey, but our sisters are also in England. And I first heard about the third country that was Rwanda when I thought it was crazy when it came up. And so part of the problem is we're getting used to crazy. Our bar of what is appropriate and what is allowed is getting lowered and lowered and lowered. And we have, Pope Francis talked about the globalization of indifference, and Pope Leo is talking about the globalization of powerlessness. And so I think it's a spiritual and moral crisis before we'll ever get to the political will at this point. We need to we need to take our agency and raise the moral questions, because otherwise it's never going to happen. Sorry to be a Debbie Downer on that.
Thank you all. We've received a question in the chat from Sister Charlotte Davenport. If there was not a veto power held by the Security Council, ruled by countries of global wealth and weapons holders, could multilateralism grow in the UN and in the world? Would anybody like to address that?
I mean, I could go on about how broken the Security Council is, but I think that the veto power, so migration conversations and climate change conversations at the UN don't primarily take place in the Security Council. They take place in the General Assembly, they take place in the Economic and Social. The UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is the treaty that deals with all things climate change, and those mechanisms don't have a veto power. It's one vote per member state, and so every country has the same kind of voting power on paper. However, there are some countries that are bullies and wield their political, financial, military power around, even in discussions that don't relate necessarily to peace and security. And so I'm not sure that getting rid of the veto in the Security Council will get rid of all of the problems that we have. It certainly is a structural injustice that exists in the UN system. that will probably never go away because of the way that the UN Charter is written. And the fact that it is a treaty means that if it is revised, it would need to be ratified by our Senate in the United States. The US Senate would never ratify a treaty that gets rid of the veto power in the Security Council. And probably neither would the, legislative branches, the Parliament of the United Kingdom or the, of France or Russia or China, whatever their ratification process is. They won't get rid of the veto power. But there are many conversations happening about reform of the Security Council that looks at alternatives to expanding the Security Council so that it is a bit more representative of the kind of political dynamics of the world today and not the political dynamics of 1945. But I don't think that the veto power is, or that conversation will get rid of all of the kind of challenges of multilateralism today. But there are plenty of conversations about UN reform happening now so that the UN system can become more streamlined and more fit for purpose to deal with the very real and intersectional challenges that we face today, not just with climate change, not just with migration, but also about technology, the changing nature of work. There are a lot of things going on, and so the United Nations is in a moment of transition, and so that will, things will have to change for the UN to remain relevant and effective.
Including adequate financing for the UN, right? Looks like HLPF is still on in July, so they're still funding to keep the headquarters open for now. That's good news. Noting the time, we are going to wrap up the Q&A section now, but I do want to thank, and before I turn it over to Terry one last time, I do want to thank you all again for giving us so many entry points into this conversation from the local level to the international level, and for helping us deepen our knowledge of how truly we don't have the environment in one silo over here and migration in another silo over here. These are both interconnected issues, aspects of this global poly crisis that we're facing, requiring a number of actions and changes and solutions on many different levels, including at the level of our heart, remembering that these are people, not statistics, remembering that every action that we take here in New Jersey has meaning and strikes at the heart of empire, if you will. And I hope that everybody on this call doesn't let this just be one more video that you watched, one more webinar that you zoomed into, but rather plant some seeds that you can water and that you can carry with you after this call. So talk about what you heard tonight with other people. Think about what actions you and your neighbors or your faith community might be able to take together after this call. And really take this group who's here and let it expand and expand. Thank you to all of our speakers. And for one last time, we'll bring up Terry to bring us home.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. Our speakers actually, covered the topics very well. Can everyone see my screen? I think not.
No, not yet.
Okay. Here we are. And now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, our speakers covered the topics very well, so I think I can go through this quickly. Did I lose you?
We are not seeing the present. Oh, now we're seeing the presenter view, so we can see your first slide.
Okay. Yeah, some of my slides come from a Caritas report, Displaced by a Changing Climate. And I've put the link to that report in the chat. This slide comes from that report, and this, I think, kind of summarizes what each of our speakers talked about, that there are a number of factors that drive migration. They're shown on the left-hand side of this slide. And on the right-hand side, there are what they call pull factors. People come seeking improvements in income, peace and security, governance, access to services, and so forth. But climate is a factor that complicates all of these things, primarily making the push factors or the drivers of migration, in some way worse and more complicated. And I think all of our speakers talked about that, so I won't dwell on it. But I want to mention this video, which if you haven't seen it, I urge everyone to look at it. It's on YouTube, and it's free to download and look at. This talks about Pope Leo's experience writing the Laudato Si encyclical. And specifically, he met with protagonists from all over the world who shared with him how climate change was affecting their lives. And particularly in some of them, you will see it illustrated very well in real terms, how climate change has driven these people and really given them very, very little hope other than migrating. It's a very entertaining movie as well as being very educational. It's not very long. I think it's about an hour and a half. So I urge you, if you have not seen it, to please look at it. It will really give you some real insight on this issue. This again is from the Caritas report, and it shows, many of the losses and damages that migrants face when they are forced to migrate without the policy framework, without legal protections, without practical support. Economic losses and damages, which I think we can easily envision, but non-economic losses and damages too, particularly in form of mental health impacts and physical health impacts. The host communities, as we know, are also affected when migration is unplanned and unsupported. Local communities suffer economic losses and damages as well as non-economic ones. And at the regional, national, and subnational scale, these losses and damages are also issues that occur. Susan particularly talked about what's happening in New Jersey when migrant families settle, and they tend to settle in the most environmentally compromised terrain or locations, if I can put it that way, because frankly, there are cultural factors, that draw them to other immigrant communities, and because property values are low, and it's an economical choice for them. But these neighborhoods with people of low income, people of color, and immigrants are very often in greater proximity to industrial hazards and waste sites. Susan mentioned that. They experience higher levels of air toxicity and drinking water contamination, and they are more exposed to natural disasters and other impacts caused by climate change. So the cumulative effect of all these environmental inequities leads to increased risk for long-term health issues. There's higher incidence of asthma, impaired brain development, kidney failure, and cancer. At the same time, the other side of this coin is that immigrants face unique barriers to seeking care, particularly healthcare, due to policy restrictions. And that is true both for documented as well as undocumented immigrants. The barriers are different, but they all face barriers to seeking healthcare. So the upshot of all of this is that the prolonged exposure to environmental inequities combined with their healthcare hurdles has serious long-term impacts for migrants and particularly for children. So what can faith-based organizations do? Again, this comes from the Caritas report. I won't touch on all of these, but one is to model best practices, and this is particularly true for faith-based organizations that are actually involved in providing practical support to migrants. But we can all document experiences, share the lived realities like we're doing here tonight as a means of raising awareness. Dialogue, like we're doing here tonight, facilitate inclusive dialogue, again, to raise awareness of these issues. And I think Cecily mentioned this in particular, advocate, keep the focus of policymakers on human dignity in the planning for migration and developing legal policy and funding frameworks. Again, that term dignity comes up here at the bottom, and it reminds us of Pope Leo, who has been a very, very strong advocate for promoting human dignity during his recent tenure as Pope. Okay, Sister Susan gave us calls to action. These are from her slides, or some slides that she shared with us earlier. She's urging us to call the Newark field office and the GEO group and to demand at Delaney Hall a number of things here that are needed to protect human dignity. I think we'll share this slide with the participants later. We don't have time to go through all the points now. A call here from Susan to call the governor's office and demand that Delaney Hall restore visitation hours for all units all week long. And a call to email the ICE deportation officer, his name and email is here, to demand the immediate release of all women, starting with those under the age of 21 and those who have medical conditions and mothers. Susan also put links in the chat to a GoFundMe page and La Huelga website where you can find additional information, calls for action about how you can support migrants in all this. So, yeah, I think that brings us to an end. And let me say on behalf of the Laudato Si Movement New Jersey chapter, firstly, big thanks to Water Spirit for giving us the opportunity to co-sponsor this webinar together with you. As Blair has mentioned, the New Jersey chapter is fairly new. This is our first collaborative activity with Water Spirit. I think it's been a big success, and I look forward to future collaboration with Water Spirit. Also, very big thanks to our speakers, Amali, Cecily, and Susan, who gave us great presentations. All participants in the webinar are urged to keep in touch with us both. So you see the website and email addresses of Water Spirit here on your screen, and also the website and email address of Laudato Si Movement New Jersey chapter. So if you have not connected with us as yet, please do so. We would love to stay in contact with you. So I think with that, again, thank you to everyone, and particularly let me say thank you to the participants who stayed with us during the webinar, and have a good night, and God bless us all.
Thank you very much, Terry. And thank you to our participants who have stuck with us all of this time. I do see a note from Amali that she would like to share a few final advocacy points as well. I'd also like to share an invitation to all of our speakers to contact the event organizers with any additional links or anything else you would like all of the participants to receive after this call. And once we have the video available on YouTube, we'll be sure to follow up via email with everybody with any additional actions that can be taken. Amali, over to you for some closing words.
No, not closing words, but Blair and Terrence, thank you so much. I think I mentioned with respect to Delaney Hall and just immigration detention in general, that Terrence and Sister Susan have spoken so well about. I would love to put this link in the chat that will give everybody a little bit more information, but the importance of all of us calling on our electeds, the importance of divesting from for-profit detention centers, GEO, CoreCivic, there are many others. This is a massive business. So we as electeds should be thinking about where does ICE, which has the largest share of the federal budget, and it's been growing and growing and growing, and it grew to its largest share just a few months ago. So we can all be very noisy about this, and ask our electeds to divest from the border industrial complex and its many actors, because it's not just a physical wall. It's not just a utilization of municipal and state lands for detention and jails. It's also surveillance. And so it's the use of tech actors that are in a revolving door of government contracts that surveil immigrants and migrants, asylees, and also all of us. Every single time we are moving, when Sister Susan is doing that work, she's also being surveilled. So really think about, does this represent what you believe your civic and political rights are supposed to be? And then the expansion of the border wall and its militarization. So I could not leave this webinar without mentioning that. And our very good friends at the American Friends Service Committee, that I'm sure we all know, has done some incredibly good investigative work of who these actors are. So I would welcome people to look at that, or invite people to look at that link. And with that, I will be quiet. Thank you, Blair.
No, thank you for making sure those critical reminders made it into this conversation as well, Molly. I mean, this easily we could have spent the entire day together with all of you. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you once again, Molly, Cecily, and Susan, for being here, for sharing these stories. Hopefully the conversation can continue. Thank you to all of our participants in this evening's event. May we all go forward and create the more just and dignified world that everybody deserves, and do it together. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.